Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. It's 9:30 here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Kopek, and I'm the VP of Marketing here with Higher Level, and you have joined our HiNotes program for June. Excited about this topic. We have Adam Bryant with MMA with us, and we work with him closely on our accident prevention and work comp policies. And so excited to have Adam share with us today some takeaways on how you can keep your business safe. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. You are set up in listen-only mode. So what does that mean? You have to be all ears today. But we do want to hear your questions, and so we will save time at the end of the presentation. You can type in the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So feel free to use that, and I'll relay those questions to Adam towards the end of our presentation. The call today will last less than an hour. We're looking at maybe around 45 minutes. And before we get started, I would like to introduce Adam and kind of share a little bit more about his experience. Adam Bryant is a senior safety advocate at Marsh McLennan Agency. Adam provides his clients with policy development, on-site and remote training for managers and staff, and on-site safety audits. By recognizing the ROI in an effective safety program, Adam has consistently cut expenses for his clients by 20 to 40%. He's worked with over 500 employers across several different industries, really to help create and establish safety programs from scratch. Super excited to have you today, Adam. I will pass it off to you.
All right, thank you, Erin. Thanks everybody for taking the time to join us here today. We are going to cover some of the basics of accident investigation as well as ergonomic injury prevention. So we always start with why the investigate. So why do we do the investigations? So obviously to prevent reoccurrence from occurring, to identify any outdated or unused procedures, whether that be lockout, tagout, whether that be fall protection, whatever those procedures may be. Improvements to the work environment. So maybe there was identified that some of the machine guarding wasn't adequate enough, so we would definitely look for improvements on that. Determine compliance with regulations, so looking at the OSHA regulations as well as any of those other supporting bodies like NFPA, NEC, those types of regulations. Determine the cost of incident. How much is this going to actually cost us in the end run? I typically use the Safety Pays, which is a website that's embedded in OSHA's websites to help small businesses understand the cost of workers' compensation and how much extra revenue you need to make in order to cover that loss. Raise safety awareness in general to others that may be impacted or affected by the potential incident that has occurred. And then finally, showing commitment to employees about safety. So typical excuses we hear why they don't do the investigation is it's going to be more paperwork. Yes, it can be cumbersome to use all these forms we're going to talk about in a little while, but these are ultimately going to be the analysis that you're going to be able to gain from the injury itself. So you want to make sure that you are utilizing forms to keep you in line with your questioning as well as you are starting to put it together to develop your root cause. We also hear it's not going to change anything, accidents happen. Well, accidents do happen from a national perspective, but unfortunately, a lot of the accidents that we see, especially looking into staffing specifically, is there's a lot of miscare from your customers as well, in terms of not managing it appropriately, or not providing adequate PPE, whatever that may be. They weren't paying attention. Yeah, so they've already gone ahead and wrote this off as unsafe behavior, and therefore, well, if they would have been paying attention, this incident wouldn't have occurred. There's no reason to do the investigation. And then the final one there, they should have been more careful. Yes, in essence, we hope that our employees will be more careful, but that is not always the case. There are usually some contributory factors to consider. So you definitely want to be aware of that, and the only way to know that is to do the investigation. So there's three main goals of the investigation. The first one being to help identify that root cause of the incident. So what caused the incident to happen? Was it an unsafe act? Was it an unsafe condition? The second one here, to use this information to prevent similar accidents from occurring. So we definitely have recognized that this was an accident. We've determined whether it was unsafe or unsafe act or a condition. And then how do we prevent that from reoccurring? So we take that data also to trend and analyze where both we look at severity as well as frequency in terms of injuries. And as we start to develop the analysis on that, we can actually hone in on that specific injury and put together some sort of recommendation to alleviate that. The purpose of the investigation is, as I mentioned, to get the root cause analysis, not to place blame. We'll talk a little bit more about the investigation strategy as we go on. So the first thing we want to do is enforce our policy. You should have a policy on injury reporting as well as guidelines, those as far as who do they report to, when do they report. We also look for to add in the factor of quantifying the time. So is that within 8 hours, 24 hours, whatever that may be. We also look to gather information and establish those facts. What are the contributory factors? Was the floor wet? Was the pedestrian on their phone? What was the contributory factors to this? And then the biggest one is the corrective actions. You have to determine what actions are needed to prevent that from reoccurring, and then obviously going to be implementing that procedure. When we look at OSHA citations that are given to some of our clients, what we are noticing, it wasn't that they didn't do the investigation, it was that they didn't have the proper follow-up, and therefore they were given a citation based on not doing the responsible thing, and that's protect everyone in the work environment. So looking at our policy here, we want to make sure that we have that policy written and in place. There's a lot of questions about why it should be written. Everyone knows these are the forms to use. We shouldn't have a policy in place, which is okay until you start to open additional facilities and those procedures start to get more lax and the framework isn't in place. So you want to make sure this is written out so that everyone knows specifically what they should be doing. Also in your policy, you want to have when you should investigate. Are you investigating every incident? I know for staffing agency, it's very difficult to do all incidences because they are reporting to the facilities. But even from just a company's perspective, do they investigate all incidences, or are we just looking at lost time incidences? Are we going to include near misses in our investigation? What does that look like? And your policy will define that. Also, it will determine who should investigate that, those types of injuries. Is it going to be the person involved with the incident? Is it going to be our managers, our supervisors, if we have on-sites, if we have safety coordinators that are available, and then also the use of outside consultants such as myself. As mentioned, we want to define the reporting time frame. It should be quantitative. So right after the incident, that can be that can actually be argued against. So you want to make sure you're saying 10 minutes or whatever the threshold is. The second example there is 8 hours or no later than the end of your shift. Define the report call tree to a certain management. If there's different people you should be calling, whether that be plant manager or on-site manager, whatever that looks like, you want to make sure that that report to call tree is included in your policy. Should be strictly enforced too, so don't be lax on this. If you are consistently lax on this, you have a really hard time enforcing some of your policy at that point. So make sure that you are strictly enforcing this. If reported after a time frame, obviously you can't deny the claim, but by having this policy in place, you can actually discipline the employee for reporting the claim late. Now, you cannot discipline for the incident occurring, but failure to follow what the procedure was set up in the policy, and them failing to do that would obviously have that trigger to discipline. Some other implications to consider in your policy is, are we going to do drug testing? Now, OSHA has some guidance on drug testing. There was some misunderstanding for many years on OSHA says you can't drug test anymore. That's not the fact. What you need to do is have documentation of why you're drug testing. How was drugs or could have drugs been contributory to this incident? So we're not saying, hey, don't go out and do drug tests. What we're saying is, if this is a forklift operator who hit a pedestrian or hit property and caused damage, what is the likelihood that drugs could have impacted that? And it's a pretty good likelihood, and therefore you have that ability to do the drug test. Now, if I'm a pedestrian walking and I'm hit by a forklift, that would not necessarily trigger that safety sensitive, the safety sensitive side, that obviously drugs couldn't contribute to the forklift hitting me. Maybe if I ran out in front of the forklift, that could be another situation. Another consideration would be your return to work program. Do you have a return to work program? How does that look? Are you bringing people into the office? Have you created modified jobs that could potentially work? Do you have those types of positions? If you do, you want to make sure you're getting that in a written program as well. And then finally, the discipline. Is it a progressive discipline policy you have in place? Are you disciplining based on the incidences? If you are going to, you want to make sure that that discipline policy is included in your accident investigation policy. So the 3 rules of incident investigation follow along with OSHA. Document, document, document. If you don't document your findings, you won't be able to provide not only a root cause analysis, but also a corrective action. How are you going to reoccur this from happening? So let's get into some of the fact gathering here. Time is going to be of the essence. This is your most point of vulnerability. If you don't get boots on the ground as quick as possible, evidence starts to disappear. People are going to start forgetting what they talked about. And if you look at ultimately, we all in the industry refer to the upside down pyramid. Well, time is actually going to cost you money. So you want to make sure that you're getting in front of it as much as possible. Getting the appropriate people investigated or witness statements, whatever it may be, because that is ultimately going to cost you money if people start to walk off from the job and you can't get the details you needed to provide whether or not that was due to the employee's behavior or if it was due to an unsafe condition. There has been many cases of incidences that we have reviewed where it looked like the employee was at fault for sticking their hand into a machine, but what the client failed to recognize was that the engineer was coming in and removing the guards because the machinery was failing, which then the employee was required to stick their hand into the machine and correct whatever the widget is that was being produced. So you want to make sure that you're getting in front of this. You want to get the who. So who was injured, who witnessed the incident, who was the supervisor at the time of the injury, and then who are any other personnel that was in that area. So we're going to talk specifically about those forms later, but we definitely want to get the who's going to be impacted here. Be impartial and objective. Don't blame. We're just going to get the facts. You want to just say, hey, what's going on? Keep an open-ended statements. Don't use closed statements such as suggestive statements. So you want to make sure that you're, hey, can you give me a little bit more information about how this occurred? You definitely don't want to say, put words into their mouth. Keep the conversations informal. You want to keep it very light. You want to keep answers from being yes or no. You want specific details so that you can get the information needed. If you have the ability to isolate the incident, do so. Any kind of involved equipment, caution tape, lockout, tag out, clearing the area, especially for a severe injury, you definitely want to start to block off and preserve some of that evidence. If it is a fatality or something that has the big 4 where you have to report it to OSHA, you definitely want to start to isolate that scene and start to pick up as much information as possible. Compiling your background information, so gathering safety procedures. What was the procedure at the time this employee was injured? Were there specific rules for this area? Was pedestrians allowed on the floor? Was any of those specific procedures for that area? gathering maintenance records on the equipment involved, if for some reason the machinery is the root cause, you definitely want to look at those maintenance records, because it could be just due to not having adequate preventative maintenance, and then the equipment itself failed and become more of a hazard to the employees working around it. And then the final thing you want to make sure you have is specific safety training records. So what type of incident was it? If it was a hand injury or laceration with machining or with a machine, you definitely want to start looking at what the training was behind that. Did you have specific lockout tagout procedures for that machine? Did you have a machine guarding policy in place? Those are the type of things that you want to have, and then also having acknowledgement or a proof of acknowledgement from the party that was injured. Taking photos, I always say photos tell 1,000 words. You can tell a story with pictures, using different angles, zooms, etc. Shows the sizes with objects, tape measures. So basically, using a camera will help you preserve some of that evidence as you're putting your report together. So exactly where were they standing again? You can do charts, you can do diagrams, those sorts of things by just using the camera or the photos that you've already taken. As far as the interviewing goes, discuss what happened leading up to and after that incident. We definitely want to know how that incident occurred. Encourage the description in their own words. Don't put those ideas into their heads. That's leading questions. It could be it could end up getting you trouble in the long run. Don't be defensive or judgmental. We're being very open here. We just want to know exactly what happened. We're not trying to place blame on them again, and obtain only the facts, not opinions, especially when it comes to witness statements. You definitely want to make sure that you're double checking what they're saying. There are some incidences that involve like hostility in the work environment, and so if an employee has a beef with another employee, they could potentially use this as an opportunity to get back at them. So make sure that when you are looking at the witness forms that you're checking into that. Were they actually in the area at the time? Is there any camera footage to support that? So on and so forth. As far as the forms go, we're looking at 4 basic forms that we suggest as a best practice. We're looking at that supervisor form that's going to give an overall recount of what the day looked like for that employee. Obviously, the employee form is going to be what exactly occurred in that incident, what leading up to in their opinion, and then finally any witness forms, anybody what was in the area that could support some sort of statement that would give you a better idea of what was happening from a third party. And then the final one is just medical authorization. We suggest that a medical authorization be included in the incident policy or the accident investigation policy, because when you start to accumulate medical treatment records, it's very hard to get that information without a court order unless you have that medical authorization, because it would be considered HIPAA. So once all of the investigation information has been gathered, you've obviously gone through it looking for accuracy, ensuring that all the facts have been collected. You want to then look for how are you going to utilize that information. Some people use Excel spreadsheets, some people use other databases, whether that be with their work comp carrier or if they have something internally that they utilize to really look at and analyze the information. We look at thin slicing. So has this been the only incident? Is this an isolated incident within the area, or are we starting to see a trend? Is this a reoccurring incident with this specific employee? So you definitely want to start to put that information into a database so that you can do some trending and analysis on that. So some items to keep in mind to track and trend when you're doing these injuries are the employee's job title, age. I'm not going to go through all of these. You definitely want to look at the time of the day of the week, hours worked up to leading to that incident, especially if you know they have a second job or was this their 16th hour of the day. Did they do a safety orientation? We look at incidences, okay, when in their tenure of being with the company were they injured. Was it the first 30 days? Was it the first 60 days or beyond 100 days? Primarily what we see in those injury reports is they typically happen to the first 30 days, and then those that have been there more than 100 days. That would say complacency and undertrained. So you definitely want to look at some of those, that data that's going to give you a contributory factor that could have led up to that incident. So let's look at corrective actions here. We definitely want to interpret and draw conclusions. We're looking for that root cause. Was it an unsafe act? So the employee was not wearing the appropriate PPE at the time, or they were operating a piece of equipment they were not properly trained on, or was it due to an unsafe condition? So defective tools or equipment, was that machinery down for a while and then somebody just turned it back on? Did it have the appropriate parts in place? We also look at what was the lighting conditions in the area. Could the employee have tipped, or could they have looked over something that led up to that slip and fall? Those types of things want to be included in your report. Distinction between intermediate and underlining clauses. We want to look at recommendations for those key contributory factors or underlining cases, and then avoid corrective actions such as, well, I told that employee to be more careful, or I had a talk with him about how to work more safely. You want to make sure that it is being specific to the incident. So whether that's a toolbox talk, additional safety talk, or a huddle, you definitely want to make sure that those corrective actions are as specific as possible. So looking at the recommendations here, they must be communicated clearly, but then we're looking at who is this going to be communicated to: your managers, your supervisors, or your employees. We want to assign out key personnel action items, whether that be with the maintenance department, whether that be with the individuals within the area. You want to include interim and intermediate controls. If it is due to, say for instance, a machine guarding concern, maybe an interlock is missing, what are we going to do in the interim as we are waiting for those parts to come in? Having and establish a procedure for that. Strict timetable established. Again, as I mentioned earlier, OSHA citations are typically given out not for not doing the investigation, but not having a corrective action or a follow-up to ensure that that corrective action has been taken care of. Follow-up, making sure we're monitoring for improvement and getting feedback from the people that are in the area, so boots on the ground. Is this new process working out for you, or is there some modifications we need to be making? So on and so forth. So the bottom line, when an organization reacts swiftly and positively to incidences and injuries, its actions will reaffirm its commitment to the safety and well-being of its employees. This is your opportunity to show your employees that you care about their safety and health, and by answering quickly to the incidences and trying to come up with a corrective action that will ultimately help the employees, will go a long way in that employee's eyes as far as whether or not you are taking their health and safety into consideration. And that'll also make a big impact whether or not they go start to look for legal representation. So we'll talk a little bit about ergonomics here. We get our data a lot of times from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So we're looking at specifically at strains, sprains, and tears due to the material handling. This has always been one of the top 10 injuries over time. Ever since OSHA started collecting data in the 70s, sprains, strains, and tears have always been leading indicators. So the leading nature here, we're looking at sprains, strains, or tears within 4,200 days way work cases. We look at 37% of all total cases. Now, if you look at that chart, it's got all the cases from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're lumping everything into one pie chart, but you can see that 37% of the incidences are coming from those sprains and strains. And where did that typically come from is poor ergonomics. So ergonomics is defined as the scientific discipline concerning with understanding of interactions among humans and other elements of a system, and that profession that applies the theory, principles, methods, and data to designed in order to optimize human well-being and overall systems performance. Now that is a CDC definition, and I realize I read that to you verbatim, but now let's break it up. So ergonomics is meaning let's fit the job to the worker. So designing jobs, equipment, work tasks to fit the human physical characteristics and energy limitations. It considers body dimensions, mobility, the body's stress behavior, making that work fit to the person and not the person fitting to the work. So why is ergonomics important? Well, overexertion is the leading cause of those injuries we just discussed. So most costly, 37% of work comp expenses in 2015, based on the data we just got, is going to be from those injuries. We're looking at bodily reaction here: bending, climbing, reaching, standing, sitting, and slips and trips without falling is another leading cause of injuries in the workplace. And then finally, looking at repetitive motion, those positions that have short cycles, those are typically within the top 10 of the most common workplace injuries. So MSDs, so muscular skeletal disorders, affect the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels, ligaments, and tendons. Workers in many different industries and occupations can be exposed to risk factors at work, such as lifting heavy items, bending, reaching overhead, pushing, pulling heavy loads, working in awkward body positions, as well as performing the same or similar tasks repetitively, getting back to that repetitive motion. So exposures to these risk factors are called MSDs. In fact, some of the state-ran OSHA programs are requiring that people have muscular disorder preventive plans, so MDPPs in place. So California, Cal OSHA requires it, Washington, Oregon. They want to make sure that those types of programs are included. Obviously, we know MSDs can be prevented. Ergonomics, we're utilizing that to fitting the person to the job. We want to help lessen muscle fatigue, increase our overall productivity, and reduce the number of severity within the workplace. They're also referred to as, if you're unfamiliar with the WMSDs, they're also referred to as cumulative trauma disorders, CTDs, repetitive trauma disorders, which are RTDs, repetitive strain injuries, which are RSIs, repetitive motion disorders, which are RMDs, and then just overuse syndromes is the newest one I've seen pop up. So here are just some common MSD disorders you'll see. Obviously, the most known in the industry is probably carpal tunnel. We have tennis elbow, bursitis. I'm not going to read all these to you. Tendinitis. Rotator cuffs are really fragile as well. We look at Raynaud's syndrome due to vibrations, trigger finger, back strains, disability, those types of things. So most commonly affected areas with MSDs are going to be your back. We look at the backs being roughly 30% of all of the strain injuries. Arms, elbows, and shoulders would be next. Neck being the third leading, the fourth being hands, wrists, and fingers, and the fifth being the knees and ankles and feet. And you can pick this information up if you're interested in it through the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. Now, the reason I put this slide in was just to kind of give you some additional information of all the injuries and illnesses that involve the days away from work. Injuries related to repetitive motion involving those microtasks are going to have the highest rate of missed days. So that looking at the 23 being the average. Overexertion and bodily reaction is the highest incident rate of all injuries and illnesses, looking at 36 per 10,000 or 100,000 full-time workers. That's just how OSHA accounts for its data. We looked at the top 10 occupations that accounted for these, looking at nurses, assistants, CNAs, EMTs, paramedics, firefighters, highway maintenance workers, and then it gets down into the maids and housekeeping, telecommunications, and then janitors and cleaners, both being the last. So those are kind of broken up in way different industries there, but that's the top 10 leading when it comes to repetitive motions as well as overexertion and strains. So the risk of MSD injury depends on the work positions and postures, how often that task is being performed, and the level of required effort and how long that task is actually gonna last. So it's going to also depend on the work positions as well as postures. How often is that task being performed? The level, as I mentioned, of exertion it's going to take. So we look at, let's break this down a little bit, exerting excessive force. That would be such as lifting heavy objects or people, pushing or pulling heavy loads, manually pouring materials, or maintaining control of that equipment. Performing the same or similar task repetitively, getting down to that repetitive motion. So continually or frequently for an extended period of time. Again, those are typically positions that have those short cycles, whether that's constantly moving box, constantly reaching overhead, but typically those types of jobs that have short cycles. So working in awkward positions or postures, or being in the same posture for a long time, using positions that place stress on the body, such as prolonged or repetitive reaching over the shoulder height, kneeling, squatting, leaning over the counter even, or using a knife with the wrists bent, or twisting with the torso while lifting. It's interesting when we get to lifting because NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, which is OSHA's sister. That's where all the studying and all the testing used to happen before ANSI came around. They actually have a formula there that will show you, based on 8 hours per day, what the average person can lift, and it's typically around 50 pounds, as long as they're in good health. But the moment you start turning your body or lifting over top of your head, that number significantly changes. It actually comes down to about 15 to 20 pounds, depending on how many cycles per hour you're doing. So that's something else to consider. Cold temperatures is another factor here. Especially if you combined it with any of the other factors that we just discussed with. So, for example, many of the operations in meat packing and poultry processing occur in chilled product or in a cold environment. So not only do you have cold environments, but also you have heavy lifting happening at the same time. Another one here is vibration. So both the whole body as well as hand and arms can cause a number of those health effects. Hand-arm vibration can cause those small capillaries that supply nutrients to your hands more difficult to control. Vibrations cause workers to lose feeling in their hands, resulting in increased force of exertion to control those power tools. And much in the same way, gloves feel limiting their hands. That's that tingling they're going to feel in their hands. Combined exposure to several risk factors, so those few that we've already discussed, the more risk factors that we start to accumulate together, the higher the risk is for MSDs. And then after that, we're looking at potentially having to mitigate that. So our methods for training against MSD or protecting against MSDs, the first one going to be obviously establishing an ergonomic program. What does that look like? Providing adequate training for that, feedback from all those levels. We also encourage job hazard analysis, so specifically looking at the tasks. What are the tasks being done? What are the hazards that we're facing? And what are the control methods that we are putting in place? And then we're going to look at early recognition and reporting of all potential MSD. So having a policy in place that says if you are experiencing any kind of injuries and illnesses, make sure that's being reported so that way management or supervisors can address it as soon as possible. Just an example of what a job hazard analysis is here. As you can see, it's pretty basic form, just asks you for the tasks and the hazards and what type of controls are put into place. With those types of positions that have high repetitive motion, or if it has high hazard areas, you want to make sure that you have a job hazard analysis in place, just so that you can make sure you've checked all of your boxes, crossed all your T's, and dotted all your I's. So obviously we want to try to mitigate by using the engineering controls, so implement physical change to that workplace, which would obviously eliminate or reduce the hazard on the job. Use devices to lift or reposition heavy objects, reduce the weight of the load or limit the forced exertion. You can reposition a work table, or actually you can elongate or or actually create. There's lifting tables that you can utilize also for those heavy repetitive motion positions, using diverging conveyors off the line so that tasks are less repetitive, so they kind of stack themselves. You can install diverters on those conveyors to direct the materials towards the worker, so therefore you're eliminating that excessive leaning or reaching over. And then finally, you could even redesign tools to enable a neutral position. So some examples of proper work practices we can see here is require that heavy loads are only lifted by 2 people. So having that lifting policy in place. What is the maximum weight that that worker is allowed to lift? Is it 50 pounds throughout their shift? Is it 100 pounds once? Is there required for team lifting? That should be specified out as well. Establishing that system so that workers are rotated from that repetitive tasks. If you have 3 people in the same area and only one of them is doing the repetitive or heavy lifting, potentially you could cross train everyone and rotate them out for maybe an hour or 2 each day, so that you can reduce those risk factors. We have floaters also. Those provide periodic breaks between the scheduled breaks. So somebody that's just cross-trained on all functions and they just go around giving people a break throughout the day. Properly use and maintain pneumatic and power tools too. Failure in your equipment can also lead to cumulative trauma. So personal protective equipment, use protection to reduce exposed to the ergonomic related risk factors. So using padding to reduce direct contact with the hard or sharp or vibrating surfaces. Wearing good fitting thermal gloves could help out with cold conditions. Also maintaining the ability to grasp those materials easily. There's actually a letter of interpretation on OSHA's website talking about it's clarifying the use of slings and how those can be beneficial in the work environment. So if you are curious more onto that, take a look at OSHA's website on how slings can prevent repetitive motion injuries. So let's look at some potential hazards here. So reaching over or working on overhead tasks in awkward positions with hands raised above the shoulder, it's going to restrict the blood flow and could result in nerve compression. That's going to affect those upper extremities and shoulders, causing like numbness, tingling, discomfort, or fatigue within those postures for long periods of time. So this is where we start to look at our rotator cuffs. Again, we're talking with more than 2 hours per day, not necessarily throughout the work shift that accumulates for just an hour. Awkward positions while pulling with hands above the shoulders cause the increased load imposed on the shoulders, as well as your neck and back. So when performed repeatedly, these tasks are obviously going to result in overexertion and could cause some severe back or upper extremity cumulative trauma. So let's talk about some simple ways to reduce reach distances. So keeping items within close reach. So design reach distance for the shortest worker. If you have different types of workers, maybe 3 shifts that are going to be cycling in and out, design that for the shortest worker. Maybe providing a platform to allow easier access to those items. Pull out steps on vehicles. We look at elevated racks that can be lowered to an appropriate height when access is needed. As far as ways to reduce those distances, removing those obstacles out of the way, utilize equipment to raise or lower items that can move them closer. You can use gravity-fed racks. These are racks on shelves with little wheels that allow the boxes stored on them to slide forward, as well as when the front box is removed. You can get a small portable forklifts. There are forklifts you can walk around with, as you see in the example here in the picture. Those would be helpful in the workplace. Or you could just provide pick sticks or a bow peep or a bow peep. Those are hooks that allow you to pull those small items to the front. That way you're not reaching into the racks all day. So let's talk a little bit about awkward body posture. So working with the neck and back bent forward more than 30 degrees for more than 2 hours a day is going to cause some cumulative trauma to the body. If you think about it, your head weighs 10 to 12. Some people with egos will probably get up to about 15 or 20. That was a little joke I stuck in there. Neck posture is only covered by the rule if the worker is not able to vary his or her posture. So working with the neck bent like this, as you see in the picture here, is pretty common in inspection jobs. So looking down and up constantly, such as like cherry sorter, those types of things, welding, microscope work, dental hygienists. It's typically where we would see those types of injuries. Squatting for more than 2 hours a day. If the location of your work is too low, you're going to have to get into an awkward position to get to it. So typically that means bending your back, kneeling, or squatting. It also means you could be bending your head or neck forward. So you definitely want to have something in place there to mitigate that. We'll talk some solutions coming up in just a moment. Kneeling for more than 2 hours a day is a risk factor for the knee injuries, since it creates pressure on both the front of and behind the kneecap. And some of those solutions we'll talk about with the body postures here is if the body is too low, one of the considerations should be finding a way to raise the work. Do you have ability to raise that line up? Do you have ability to raise that worker up? What does that look like? If that's not possible, can you use a low stool to provide support so that they can sit lower or near that level of work? We think about like mechanics, how they use those small chairs to get around so that they're not constantly leaning over or kneeling down, causing those injuries. So looking at awkward body positions, using tooling with larger handles could be a good solution here, or alternating between how we are positioning our body. Are we bending one moment and then are we kneeling or sitting in the other? So having a consistent change in our different postures so that we don't spend too much on any one of those positions, which is ultimately going to cause cumulative trauma. So gripping 10 or more pounds of force for 2 or more hours a day is considered a cumulative trauma concern. So you want to look at our jobs involving pinch force. Even if it is weighed about, I think they call for 4 pounds over an 8-hour day, it's going to be considered a risk factor there. So an example would be an assembly job where one of the parts inserted are spring clips that require pinch force of 4 pounds to open. And so if you're doing that 8 hours a day, you're really causing a lot of cumulative trauma in your wrists. We just mentioned that, so I'll just skip over that. Let's talk some potential solutions here. So limit hand carrying stresses through design of your work layout that reduces hand carrying items. You can reduce the amount of items carried at one time, so practicing that or enforcing that through your policy. Using non-pinch grip postures, there's some examples there in the photos. Using ergonomically designed tools or aids such as friction reducing aids on fingers to reduce that amount of force that's being exerted on the pinch grip. And I think there's a picture there, yes, with the second one over there that shows you how that glove is used. And then maintaining hand posture that provide maximal finger force. Generally, the hand span should be about 1 3/4 to 2 1/4 inches for maximum finger exertion, and the hand should also be in the shape of a C. Repetitive motion, so repeating that same motion for more than 2 hours per day with hands, wrists, elbows, and shoulders or neck would be considered a repetitive motion hazards. The highest repetition rate for the same motion for at least 2 hours at a time, or using that high repetitive device such as a keyboard, mouse for more than 4 hours a day. This is just another example of intense keying for more than 4 hours a day. Very old picture here. Sorry, that's what we got with. That's what we're working with. Repetitive motions may be required by your job. A lot of times you have some control over what motions you make or how often you make those. So some of the things you can consider to reduce those that repetitive motion exposure, arranging work to avoid unnecessary motions, putting the work right in front of you as much as possible. Let the power tools do the work for you, spreading repetitive work throughout the day, taking stretch pauses. We call these flex and stretch programs, either that being done in the morning, after lunch, or after breaks. you see like larger companies like Honda, Toyota that have a lot of repetitive motion positions. They will have flex and stretch built in, especially as the heat starts to get as the temperatures start to change, whether it's getting colder, your body is getting more tense, and then as it gets hotter, it's actually getting more relaxed. So having those flex and stretches keeps the body together. Looking at localized pressure on the body, so pressing the body part against some hard or sharp edges, such as a building table or a work table, or even a conveyor system. Standing, kneeling for prolonged periods on hard surfaces, and then using tools with hard handle surfaces or short handles. Those are also going to be cumulative stress on the body. What we're looking at here with these types of concerns is affecting nerves or blood vessels, possibly causing that tingling in your fingers or even sore fingers. Contact stress, so applying contact force on the body more than 10 times per hour or more than 2 hours per day. So example would be like using a hand tool or a knee as a hammer. That's going to cause a lot of that trauma onto it's actually classified as a contusion, as a soft tissue injury. So some potential solutions here for pressure, localized pressure on the body, using tooling with longer handles, or making sure that that tool has a padded grip on it, even alternating between those positions as we talked about in the earlier slides. Changing the work position throughout the day will obviously alleviate some of that pressure. Pad table edges or desktops with rounded edges to keep that keep your wrists from putting too much trauma on there. Again, we're looking at more than 10 hours a day or consecutively for 2 hours, 2 hours for the day. Just about every job is going to require some sort of lifting, but lifting only comes a risk for injury if it's heavy lifting, if the lifting is done frequently, or if it's done in an awkward posture. Again, I would refer back to NIOSH on what we're looking at. Heavy lifting is any lift of 50 pounds or more once per day, or it's considered 50 pounds 10 or more times a day. So you want to look at those job positions you have and see if we're overexerting ourselves or if there's some sort of modification that we could put into place. Frequent lifting is 10 pounds or more than twice per minute, or for more than 2 hours per day. And that awkward lifts are lifts for 25 pounds or more above the shoulders, below the knees, or out of arm's length, done more than 25 times per day. Most people are aware that lifting those heavy objects increase that risk for injury. So you want to make sure that you are going through in your orientation on proper lifting techniques, lifting with your legs and not your back. Maybe get into some of the slides as you're seeing here, maybe some pictures to show them what awkward positions look like or awkward lifting looks like that would potentially lead up to their injury. So let's talk some potential solutions here would be plan the overflow to eliminate unnecessary lifts, organize the work so that the physical demands of the work pace increases gradually, minimize the distance loads are lifted and lowered, position pallet loads of materials at a height that allows workers to lift or lower within their power zone. The power zone is between the shoulders and the knees. Avoid manually lifting or lowering loads to or from the floor. Obviously, we're getting into an awkward position here. Store materials or products off of the floor using those tables we talked about earlier. Arranging materials to arrive on pallets and keeping those materials on pallets during storage. If you're going to be using pallets, it's a good opportunity to use your forklifts. Arrange the material to offload it directly onto those storage shelves. Store only lightweight. That's going to be put up into the upper parts of the racks. Additionally here, the use of stretching is obviously going to be an appropriate method. Stretching may not be used in a place of like engineering or administrative improvements. This would just supplement that. So for instance, you can't use that as a control method for cumulative trauma disorder, you would only use that to supplement. Your first line would be to set up appropriate ergonomic plan, and then build the workstation off of that. Using proper techniques, lifting techniques, as we just mentioned, is going to go a long way as far as you can utilize this during your orientations. As far as vibrations go, we're looking at moderate, high to prolonged. Moderate being more than 2 hours per day, but high exposure would be more than 30 minutes per day. As far as a solution goes, using those low vibration tools or devices that would reduce that in the heavy or light industrial, but heavy assembly areas, we look at tool balancers or extension handles, vibration isolators, damper techniques. Those are types of methods that can be used to reduce the vibration. Also, by just like repetitive motion, by adding in additional rest periods or rotating those jobs out, is going to be a good way to reduce that risk factor. And then if the machinery itself is vibrating just due to poor maintenance, so increasing the preventative maintenance on that, and then ultimately by providing personal protective equipment. As far as environmental hazards go, they're going to amplify and increase the risks of our MSDs. So we look at hot weather, cold weather, as we just talked about earlier, high temperatures indoors and cold temperatures indoors, so walk-in freezers, cold processes room. All those are covered now under OSHA's. OSHA's actually coming out with a new emphasis program specifically for heat-related illnesses right now. The cold weather one was something they focused on years ago. So if you want more information on that, I encourage you to go to OSHA's website and check out what information they have regarding how the temperature will ultimately increase or amplify the risk of musculoskeletal disorders. So 5 points to remember here would be ergonomics can help you with your job or help the workers on the job. It's a tool itself to make the job safer and better. In jobs with enough exposure to risk factors, work-related musculoskeletal disorders can occur. So we want to make sure that we are applying ergonomics when we can. We can't stress this point enough. If you start having symptoms with those, with the cumulative trauma disorders that we were just talking about, be sure to report them. Having that policy in place, maybe that's something you're covering during the orientation with the workers as you're starting to talk about injuries. But honestly, if you're going to be having a worker that is going to be exposed to repetitive motion, maybe take them on the floor and have them look over that job and make sure that they're okay with doing that job for that prolonged area. With that being said, that's all I got for you. We'll take this time to answer some questions you might have.
Thank you so much. Lots of really great information. So now's the time that you've all been waiting for. If you have questions, you can use that message question box in your GoToWebinar panel. We'll give you a couple minutes. So Adam, I know at the very beginning you talked about, establishing safety programs, and that's something that you have experience in. So what would you say to our listeners today if they don't already have something really started with safety program? They're kind of at the ground floor. What advice would you give them to get started?
Yeah, I would recommend just using Google. Just Google a simple, what we call an injury and illness prevention plan, or an I2P2, and that will give you really the framework to start developing some of your policy off of. As you start to get into some of the specific ones, as we just talked about, accident investigation or ergonomics, you can also Google those types of topics that will help you then expand that policy into your I2P2, and then passing that on forward to your employees.
And I know we deal with a lot of, obviously we work in many different states, and looking at our viewers here today, it's kind of spread out all over. Are there state-specific considerations whenever developing these programs and documents?
Yeah, so obviously everyone has to meet the federal guidelines, federal OSHA, as far as compliance goes. But depending on your jurisdiction, there are those states that are going to exceed OSHA's expectations. We use California just because it's the most strenuous. they actually have requirements to have, like we said, the musculoskeletal disorder prevention plan. That has to be built into your injury and illness prevention plan. Most states don't require you to have what we call the safety manual, not the handbook, but the safety manual, which is the injury and illness prevention plan. But as we're starting to see a change in culture in general, we're seeing more states pushing that more and more, and they're starting to pick up on some of these other more proactive states like Washington, Oregon, California, New York, New Jersey. They're pretty proactive in the safety world. They're built for the employees, not the employer, if you will. And so therefore just pay attention to your state laws as especially as it starts to impact your safety programming.
Great, thank you for that. Well, I don't see any other questions come in, so you must have been thorough today. Appreciate everyone's time, everybody that attended with us this morning, and especially yours, Adam. Before we wrap up, I do want to share, so in July we have a topic coming up. So we are partnering with Acclaim HR Consulting, and they are talking all about documentation, you know, when it comes to injuries, when it comes to workplace compliance. It's all about good documentation. We talked about that today. And so we'll kind of carry on that topic and more best practices in July. So make sure you tune in for that. You can reach me directly at hello@higherlevel.com and be happy to make sure you're registered for that. But stay tuned, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.